What started as a celebration of love turned into a shocking nightmare. During their engagement party, Claire discovered something that shattered everything she thought she knew about her fiancé. His betrayal was far worse than just an affair. And what she uncovered next? It would change the course of their lives forever. Stay tuned to find out how this bride exposed her groom's darkest secrets and the chilling twist no one saw coming. The night of Claire's engagement party was supposed to be a celebration of love. The kind of night that would forever be etched in her memory as the beginning of a new chapter. But as the champagne flowed and the laughter of their friends and family filled the air, Claire could feel something was off. She stood in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by the glow of crystal chandeliers, golden tablecloths, and the soft hum of conversations. But all she could think about was Ethan. Ethan, her fiancé, the man she had believed was the one. He was supposed to be her everything, her safe place, the person who would never let her down. Yet, as she caught his eye across the room, a chill ran down her spine. He was smiling, but it wasn't the smile that made her heart race like it used to. This one was forced, too tight, too rehearsed. There was something in his eyes that she couldn't quite place, something that didn't belong. Her best friend Samantha was at her side in an instant, her hand resting gently on Claire's arm. "Hey, you okay?" Samantha asked, concern written across her face. Claire managed a smile, though it felt hollow. "Yeah, just tired, I guess." But the truth was, she hadn't been feeling like herself for weeks. It wasn't the wedding planning or the pressure from her family to make everything perfect. It was Ethan. He had changed. Or maybe, Claire thought with a sudden sinking feeling, he hadn't changed at all. Maybe he was always like this, and she had been too blinded by her own dreams of a fairy tale wedding to see it. As the night wore on, Claire's unease deepened. Ethan was distracted, his gaze constantly flickering to his phone, his laugh a little too loud, a little too insincere. She noticed him talking to Nina, his ex-girlfriend, in a quiet corner. She watched as Nina leaned in just a little too close, her hand resting on his arm for a beat longer than necessary. Claire's stomach twisted into knots, but she dismissed the feeling. She had to, because the alternative was a reality she wasn't ready to face. Nina had always been there, the shadow from Ethan's past. She was beautiful, confident, and far too comfortable in Ethan's presence. Claire had never liked her. There was something about Nina that made her skin crawl, but she had always chalked it up to jealousy. After all, what did she have to fear? Ethan had chosen her. He had asked her to marry him, not Nina. But tonight, for the first time, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that Nina's presence wasn't just a coincidence. It was something more. She excused herself from the group, needing a moment to clear her head. The soft clink of glasses and the murmur of voices seemed to fade into the background as she stepped into a quiet hallway. She leaned against the wall, trying to steady her breathing. The weight of the moment felt like it was pressing down on her chest. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She checked it quickly, almost instinctively, and froze. It was a text from Ethan. "We need to talk. Meet me later." Her pulse quickened. She had seen that message before, or at least something like it. It was a message he used whenever he needed to explain away an awkward situation. It was the kind of message she had come to dread over the last few weeks. "Claire, there you are," came Ethan's voice from behind her. She turned around, her heart sinking as she saw him approaching, a slight tension in his shoulders, a stiffness in his posture. He smiled, but this time there was no warmth in it, just a forced politeness that didn't reach his eyes. "Hey," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was just taking a breather." Ethan's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered. "You've been doing that a lot tonight. he said, his tone too casual, too rehearsed. "I'm fine, really." Claire hesitated, then added, "I just saw you talking to Nina. Is everything okay?" Ethan's expression shifted, the briefest flicker of panic flashing across his face before he masked it with a shrug. "Yeah, it's nothing. Just catching up." But Claire wasn't convinced. She had seen how Nina had been looking at him, how she had leaned in just a little too close. The way her laugh had lingered a little too long in his ear. Something wasn't right. "I don't like it when you keep things from me, Ethan," Claire said, her voice low but firm. She felt the words fall from her lips before she could stop them. "It feels like you're hiding something." Ethan's eyes narrowed, and he took a step toward her, his jaw clenched. "You're imagining things, Claire," he said, his voice sharper than before. "You've been paranoid all night. Relax." But Claire could hear the defensiveness in his voice, the edge that hadn't been there before. "Paranoid?" she repeated, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "You've been distant for weeks, and now you're telling me I'm paranoid? I'm not stupid, Ethan." His face hardened. "I don't know what you want me to say. It's nothing. Just drop it, okay?" Claire felt a cold wave of realization wash over her. He wasn't just lying. He was hiding something, something big. She could feel it in her bones. "Fine," she said, her voice steady despite the rage rising inside her. "But don't think I'll forget this. Don't think I'll let you get away with it." Ethan didn't respond. He just stared at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back into the crowd, leaving Claire standing there, her heart pounding in her chest. As the night went on, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. And when she caught a glimpse of Nina slipping away from the crowd again, this time with Ethan following behind her, the knot in her stomach tightened further. She didn't know what was going on, but she knew she needed answers. Later that night, in the privacy of her apartment, Claire picked up Ethan's phone from where he had left it on the kitchen counter. It was a risk, but she had to know the truth. Her hands shook as she unlocked the screen, her heart pounding as she scrolled through his messages. There were a lot of them, too many to ignore. But one stood out. A message from Nina, sent just an hour ago. "I miss you. We need to talk before she finds out." Her breath caught in her throat. Claire stared at the message, the words swimming before her eyes. Nina had known. Ethan had been seeing her behind her back, and he had been hiding it from her all along. But why? Why now, on the night of their engagement? Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of the truth. But the more she thought about it, the more the pieces didn't fit. Ethan had been acting strangely, yes, but this was something different, something deeper. Claire had no idea what was going on, but she was sure of one thing: her life was about to unravel in ways she could never have imagined. Before she could process any more, the sound of a car engine roaring outside broke her concentration. She turned toward the window, heart skipping a beat. Ethan's car was pulling into the driveway, and for the first time that night, Claire felt a deep, cold fear settling in her chest. Something was about to happen, something that would change everything. She just didn't know what yet. The next few days passed in a blur of unease and unanswered questions. Claire found herself replaying that night over and over in her mind. The image of Ethan walking away from her, lingering like a shadow she couldn't escape. She couldn't forget the coldness in his eyes, the way his smile had faltered when she'd asked about Nina. She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to break, something far worse than the distance she'd already sensed between them. At work, Claire found it hard to concentrate. Every time her phone buzzed, her stomach tightened in anticipation. She checked it obsessively, expecting a message from Ethan, some kind of explanation, some kind of reassurance. But it never came. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air, The only messages she received were from Samantha, asking how she was holding up if she wanted to talk. But Claire didn't have the words, not yet. Ethan didn't return her calls either. For the first time in their relationship, he was completely unreachable. She told herself it was because of the pressure, the stress of the wedding coming up, but the gnawing feeling in her gut told her otherwise. And when she received a cryptic message from Nina that evening, it became clear. We need to talk. It's time for you to know the truth. Claire's hands trembled as she read the words again. She didn't know why, but she felt like she was standing on the edge of something, the ground beneath her feet beginning to crack. She couldn't ignore it anymore. She needed answers, needed to understand what had been happening behind her back. That night, after an agonizing hour of indecision, Claire drove to the address Nina had sent her. The house was an old, sprawling thing on the outskirts of town, isolated and quiet, with a long, winding driveway that made it seem even more remote. Claire's heart pounded as she parked at the end of the drive, unsure of what she would find. She had known Nina had a lot of power over Ethan. She had seen it in the way Nina had moved in and out of his life without question, without apology. But she hadn't known how far the manipulation had gone, how deep the betrayal ran. This meeting, whatever it was about, would reveal everything, and Claire wasn't sure if she was ready for the truth. But she had no choice. She had to know. When she rang the doorbell, it took only a few moments before Nina answered, her smile a little too wide, a little too knowing. "Claire, right on time," Nina said, her voice smooth. But there was something in her eyes that Claire didn't trust. It wasn't just that her eyes were cold. It was the way they seemed to size her up, like Claire was a puzzle Nina had already solved. "Where's Ethan?" Claire demanded, barely able to keep the edge out of her voice. Nina stepped aside, gesturing for Claire to come in. "Ethan's not here. He won't be for a while," she said, her tone casual. But Claire heard the subtle note of warning in it. Nina wasn't offering this information out of kindness. She was trying to manipulate the situation, trying to control it in a way that made Claire feel small, insignificant. "Then why are we meeting?" Claire's voice cracked slightly, betraying her rising anxiety. Nina closed the door behind her with a soft click, the silence between them stretching long and heavy. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked into the living room, where a dim light from a nearby lamp cast strange shadows against the walls. She motioned for Claire to sit, but Claire didn't. She stayed standing, tense, her body bracing for whatever came next. Finally, Nina spoke, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. "You want to know the truth, don't you?" Claire's throat tightened. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Nina's smile deepened, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that suggested she knew something Claire didn't, and it was giving her a sick pleasure. "Ethan isn't the man you think he is. He never has been." The words hit Claire like a physical blow. She staggered slightly, her breath catching in her chest. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, barely able to hold it together. Nina leaned back on the couch, crossing her legs with an air of casual superiority. "I'm not saying he's a bad person, Claire, but he's not the perfect guy you think he is. He never was. And neither were you." Claire flinched, her body stiffening at Nina's words. She could feel the walls of the room closing in around her, could feel her pulse hammering in her ears. The insinuation was clear. Nina had something on her too, something Claire didn't know about, something dark. "You're lying," Claire said, her voice rising, a desperate edge creeping in. She took a step forward, closer to Nina. "What did you do to him? What are you planning?" Nina's eyes flickered just for a moment, and Claire caught the change, the subtle shift of emotion that was too quick for most to notice. She was hiding something. "I didn't do anything, Claire. I didn't need to," Nina replied smoothly, her voice taking on a mocking tone. "Ethan's always been like this. Always needed a little something on the side to keep himself entertained. And that's where I come in." Claire recoiled, horrified. "What do you mean?" Nina leaned forward now, her expression turning almost pitying. "Ethan doesn't love you. He never did. He just wanted the image, the story. But there's only one thing he's ever loved, Claire. Power. Control." Claire's head spun, each word piercing her like a knife. "You're wrong," she whispered, more to herself than to Nina. "He proposed to me. He asked me to be his wife. We're—" "No, you're not. Not really." Nina's voice was ice cold now, cutting through Claire's denials. "You're just another prize for him to put on a shelf, to show off. When he's done with you, he'll toss you aside, just like he did with me." Claire felt the weight of Nina's words crushing her. Everything she had believed in, everything she had built with Ethan, was starting to crumble. It wasn't just about infidelity anymore. It was about the fact that the man she thought she knew had never existed. Just then, the door to the living room creaked open, and Ethan stepped into the room. Claire froze, her breath catching in her throat as she turned to face him. His eyes widened in surprise, but there was no apology there, no remorse, only a flash of guilt, quickly hidden behind a mask of indifference. "Ethan," Claire said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "What the hell is going on?" Before he could answer, Nina's voice rang out, calm and sure. "He's been seeing me for months, Claire. And now that I've told you, I'm done. He's all yours. Enjoy." Ethan's eyes flickered between them, but he didn't say a word. Claire felt her heart shatter as the truth sank in. Everything she had built with him, her dreams, her future, had been built on lies, and now she was left with nothing. But there was one more thing she hadn't seen coming. Just as Claire turned to leave, something caught her eye, a shadow in the corner of the room, just out of view. She spun around in time to see Ethan's hand jerk out, a sudden flash of movement too quick for her to comprehend. There was a sharp, sickening sound, the thud of something hitting the floor, followed by a gasp. Claire's eyes went wide as Nina crumpled to the ground, blood beginning to pool around her. Ethan stood frozen, his hand still extended. The room was silent, except for the harsh sound of Claire's breathing. Claire's heart thudded in her chest as the reality of what she was seeing slowly began to sink in. Nina lay on the floor, her body twitching slightly as blood pooled beneath her, staining the hardwood. Her eyes were wide open, unblinking, staring at the ceiling in horror. Claire froze, rooted to the spot, her brain failing to process what had just happened. Ethan stood motionless, his arms still outstretched, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. It was as if time had stopped, the air thick with the sudden, overwhelming silence. Claire's breath caught in her throat. "Ethan," she whispered, the word leaving her lips like a prayer. But he didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on Nina's body, his eyes vacant, distant, as though he was seeing something far beyond her. Claire took a hesitant step toward him, her voice shaking as she tried again. "Ethan, what did you do?" His head snapped toward her, his face finally registering the reality of what had just occurred. His eyes darkened, and for the first time since this nightmare had started, there was no control in them. There was only fear, raw, unfiltered fear. I didn't mean to," Ethan muttered, his voice barely audible. His hand dropped to his side, trembling. Claire couldn't move. Her feet felt glued to the floor, her body frozen by the horror of the moment. "You didn't mean to," she repeated, her voice breaking. "You didn't mean to? Ethan, you—" She was interrupted by the sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder by the second. Her blood ran cold. The sound was too close, too immediate. Somebody must have heard the gunshot. Somebody had to have heard it. The sirens were approaching, and the weight of what was about to happen settled over Claire like a suffocating blanket. "Ethan," Claire said again, her voice now desperate. "What is going on? What did you do?" Ethan backed away from Nina's body, stumbling toward the door, his breathing erratic. "You don't understand," he whispered, the words so low Claire almost couldn't hear them over the rising wail of the sirens. "You don't understand, Claire. I didn't mean to. But she was going to ruin everything. I couldn't let her do that to us, to you. Ruin everything." Claire felt a wave of nausea sweep over her, and she gripped the doorframe to steady herself. "What the hell are you talking about? Nina's dead, Ethan. You killed her." "No," he said, shaking his head furiously. "It was an accident. It was supposed to be a warning, Claire, not this. She was going to expose me. She was going to ruin everything." "Expose you?" Claire's mind reeled. What was Ethan talking about? What could Nina have known that could be so devastating that it would lead him to kill her? The sirens were closer now, the wail rising in volume, and with it, the frantic desperation in Ethan's voice. "I had to stop her. You don't understand. Nina knew everything about what I've been hiding, about us. I couldn't let her tear us apart." Claire's stomach churned as she realized what Ethan was admitting to. "What have you been hiding, Ethan?" she demanded. The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of the truth she didn't want to hear, but knew she had to. Ethan's eyes flickered toward Nina's lifeless form, then back to Claire. For a moment, it seemed like he was going to break, to tell her everything, but then the coldness returned. His face hardened, and the fear that had once consumed him was replaced by something else, something darker, colder. "You don't want to know," he said quietly. "Trust me, you don't want to know." But Claire did. The more Ethan spoke, the more she realized that everything about their relationship, their engagement, their life together, had been built on lies. And it wasn't just the affair with Nina. It was something bigger, something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The shriek of a police siren cut through the silence, growing louder as it neared. Ethan looked at Claire one last time, his expression unreadable, and then he turned and bolted for the back door. "No!" Claire screamed, her voice raw with panic. She reached out, but he was already gone, disappearing into the night. She stood there, trembling, her mind spinning. What just happened? What had Ethan done? She looked back at Nina's lifeless body, the reality of the murder sinking in. The door to the living room burst open, and Claire was jolted out of her daze. 2 police officers rushed in, their faces tense, their hands already on their holsters. "Stay back," one of them ordered, his voice sharp as he assessed the scene. Claire didn't move. Her legs felt weak beneath her, and she barely managed to stay on her feet. He shot her," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The officer glanced at Nina's body and then back to Claire. "Who shot her?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "Where is the suspect?" "I don't know," Claire replied, her voice trembling. He ran. He killed her. He killed Nina." The officer moved quickly, pulling out his phone. "Stay where you are," he ordered, before rushing out to call for backup. Claire stood frozen in the middle of the room, her mind still reeling from the horror of what had just occurred. Her thoughts kept circling back to Ethan. He had run. He had disappeared into the night. But why? Was it because he feared the consequences of his actions? Or was it because he knew that this was only the beginning, that everything was about to come crashing down? Another officer entered the room, her eyes scanning the area, taking in the blood on the floor, the overturned chair, and the empty look on Claire's face. "Ma'am, we need to take you in for questioning," the officer said gently, though her tone was firm. "We need to know everything, right now." Claire nodded, her heart still pounding. She had no choice. The truth was unraveling piece by piece, but the truth wasn't something she could avoid anymore. Ethan was gone, and everything he had been hiding was about to come to light, whether she was ready for it or not. As the officers led her outside, Claire's mind was consumed by one question. What had Ethan really been hiding? And just how far was he willing to go to protect his secrets? But the answers were coming, whether she was ready for them or not. The sirens were getting louder, and there was no turning back now. The next few days felt like a blur to Claire. She had been questioned multiple times by the police, each session pulling her deeper into a web of confusion, anger, and disbelief. She had told them everything she knew about Ethan and Nina, but the more she spoke, the less certain she became of anything. Nothing made sense. Her world, her entire reality, had been shattered, and now she was drowning in the aftermath. Ethan was still missing, a fugitive now, his face plastered on every news outlet, his name trending across social media. But the more the police dug into his life, the more chilling secrets came to light. The affair with Nina was just the beginning. It was becoming clear that Ethan had been hiding far darker, more dangerous truths. Claire sat in the small, sterile interrogation room at the police station, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, staring at the table in front of her. The officers had been kind, patient, but the questions kept coming. They asked her about Ethan's behavior, about his relationships, about any signs that he might have been involved in something criminal. Claire kept answering, each answer peeling back another layer of Ethan's lies. One detective, a gruff man with sharp eyes and a somber demeanor, had been especially persistent. "What about his finances, Ms. Blackwell? Did you know anything about his money problems?" Claire blinked, taken aback by the question. Ethan had never mentioned anything about financial trouble. He had always been careful with money, always in control. The idea of him being in debt, or worse, involved in something illegal, seemed impossible. I don't know," Claire stammered. "We never really talked about that kind of stuff. I know he was successful at work, but—" "You didn't think to ask about his finances?" the detective pressed, his voice sharp. "You didn't wonder why he'd been so secretive, why he was always so careful with his money?" Claire's stomach twisted. She hadn't thought to ask, no. But now that he was gone, now that she had been forced to confront the extent of his lies, she felt like a fool. How many other things had she missed? How many other truths had he buried beneath layers of charm and manipulation? "I don't know," she repeated, more to herself than to the detective. "I didn't know him at all. I thought I did, but—" Her voice trailed off as the door to the room opened and another officer entered, holding a thick file. He set it down in front of her with a soft thud. "This came in this morning," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "It's about Ethan's past. We've been digging into his history. You might want to see this." Claire looked at the file, her heart racing. The officer slid it toward her, and she reluctantly opened it, her fingers trembling. Inside were several pages of old records, criminal records, financial documents and photographs. At first glance they seemed completely disconnected, random even. But then she saw it. One of the photos was of Ethan, but it wasn't from any recent time. The picture was old, black and white, a photo from a police record. The date on the record caught her eye. 1998. Ethan, barely a teenager, was arrested for something, but the details were sparse. Just a few lines of text about a violent altercation with another young man. A fight, the record said. The case had been closed with a plea deal, the charges dropped in exchange for some kind of probation. Claire's throat went dry. She hadn't known about this. She had no idea that Ethan had a violent history. She had no idea that he had ever been in trouble with the law, let alone for something so serious. She kept flipping through the pages. More documents, more photographs. The deeper she went, the darker the revelations became. A police report from a decade earlier, showing Ethan's involvement in a dangerous gambling ring. He had been linked to money laundering, but somehow, always, he had escaped serious consequences. Each time he'd been caught, he'd slipped through the cracks, his charm and connections bailing him out. It became clearer now. Ethan wasn't just a man who cheated on her with an ex-girlfriend. He was a man with a history of violence, deceit, and manipulation. And Nina, the woman who had always seemed like a rival, an unwelcome presence in Claire's life, wasn't just an ex-girlfriend. She had known something that could bring Ethan's entire world crashing down. Claire slammed the file shut, her hands shaking. She was suffocating under the weight of the truth, but she couldn't stop herself. She had to keep digging. She had to understand what was happening, why Ethan had acted the way he did, why he had gone so far. Her phone buzzed, snapping her back to reality. It was a message from Samantha. "Claire, I just saw the news. They found Nina's body. The police are saying it wasn't just a murder, it was staged." Claire's blood ran cold. Staged? What did that mean? Why would Ethan or anyone stage a murder? Before she could process this new piece of information, the door to the interrogation room opened again. This time, it was the detective from earlier, the one who had been asking about Ethan's finances. He didn't look pleased. "Ms. Blackwell, we need to speak," he said, his tone clipped. "There's been a development, something you need to know." Claire followed the detective out of the room, her mind racing. She had a sinking feeling in her gut that whatever was about to happen was going to change everything. They walked through the narrow, sterile hallways of the police station until they reached a small conference room. "Sit down," the detective said, gesturing to the chairs. He took a seat across from her and opened a new file, placing it in front of her. "There's something we found," he said, his voice now low and serious. "Something you might want to hear before you make any decisions." Claire opened the file, her hands shaking. She skimmed through the first few pages, but then froze as she reached a set of photographs. They were blurry, taken from a distance, but they were clear enough for Claire to make out the two figures in them, Ethan and Nina. They were standing on the edge of a bridge, facing each other. Nina's expression was tense, almost pleading. Ethan's face was unreadable, his posture rigid. But the next image, the next one, made Claire's stomach drop. It showed Ethan with something in his hand, a gun. Claire's breath hitched. "What is this?" she asked, her voice hoarse. The detective didn't answer right away. Instead, he slid another sheet of paper across the table. It was a transcript from a phone call recorded 2 weeks ago. Ethan had been speaking to someone. "Ethan, if Nina opens her mouth, if she tells anyone what she knows, she's a liability. I can't let her ruin this for me." The words were like a punch to the gut. Claire's head spun, and she had to blink away the haze in her vision. "She knew, didn't she?" Claire whispered. "Nina knew everything about him." The detective nodded grimly. "Yes, Miss Blackwell, Nina knew too much. She was threatening to expose Ethan's entire operation, his connections, his criminal activities, and that's why he had to silence her." Claire's mind reeled. It wasn't just a crime of passion. It wasn't just jealousy or rage. It was something far more calculated. Ethan had killed Nina to protect himself, and now Claire realized the true depth of the darkness that had been lurking beneath his charming exterior all along. But what if Nina hadn't been the only one he needed to silence? What if Claire was next? Before she could process this thought, the detective leaned forward. "We need your help, Claire. Ethan's gone underground, but we believe he's planning something big. We need you to help us find him before it's too late." Claire's mind was reeling, but the one thing that had become crystal clear in that moment was that the life she thought she knew, everything she had believed about Ethan, was nothing but a lie. and the only way to stop him was to uncover every secret he had hidden, no matter how dangerous the truth might be. Ethan was on the run, but Claire was running out of time. She had to make a choice. Would she be the one to bring him down, or would she become the next victim of a man who would stop at nothing to protect his dark secrets? And with that, her journey into the depths of Ethan's twisted world had only just begun. Claire couldn't breathe. The weight of the detective's words pressed on her chest, suffocating her. Ethan wasn't just some cheat. He wasn't just a man with a dark past. He was a criminal mastermind, a man capable of things she couldn't even begin to imagine. And now she was tangled in his web of lies, deception, and murder. Her mind raced. She had to find him. She had to understand how far he was willing to go and why. But what could she possibly do? She wasn't a detective. She wasn't a killer. She was just a woman who had been in love with a man who turned out to be a monster. The detective's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "We believe he's heading towards the old warehouse district on the outskirts of town. We need you to come with us. You might be the only one who can get through to him." Claire's heart sank. Ethan was dangerous. His behavior was unpredictable, and now he was cornered, desperate. She'd seen a glimpse of the darkness inside him, the rage, the coldness. There was no telling what he might do next. She stood, her legs shaky, and followed the detective down the hallway, out of the station. The night was thick with tension, the city streets empty under the oppressive glow of streetlights. The police car ride to the warehouse district was silent, the officers in the front seat exchanging uneasy glances. Claire sat in the back, her thoughts a storm of confusion. Why me? She kept asking herself. Why did they think she could reach him? The Ethan she had known, charming, confident, loving, was gone. The man she was chasing now was a stranger, a killer. The warehouse district loomed ahead. The buildings were dark, abandoned, a forgotten corner of the city that seemed to hide its secrets in the shadows. As the car pulled to a stop, Claire felt her stomach drop. This place was a graveyard of broken dreams and lost hopes. She could feel it in her bones. Something terrible was about to happen. The detective turned to her. "Stay close. We don't know what we're walking into. If you see him, stay calm. He might listen to you." Claire nodded, though she didn't know if she could remain calm. There was so much at stake now, so much she didn't understand. But one thing was clear. She had to face Ethan. She had to make him pay for Nina's death. They stepped out of the car and moved toward the first warehouse. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the night, the stillness of the place unnerving. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as they approached the massive metal doors. Suddenly a figure appeared in the shadows. Ethan. He was standing there just out of reach, his face illuminated by the weak light from the street lamps. He looked like the man she had once loved, but his eyes, they were cold, hollow. The warmth was gone. The man she had known was lost. "Ethan," Claire called, her voice trembling. "It's over. You can't run anymore. The police are here. They know everything." He didn't move, just stood there, watching her with those empty eyes. "You don't understand, Claire," he said softly, his voice tinged with something darker. "I didn't want this. I didn't want any of it to happen." The detective motioned for Claire to step back, but she didn't. She took a step toward him. "You killed Nina, Ethan. You killed her because she knew the truth about you, and now you're running." He flinched at her words, a brief moment of vulnerability flashing across his face. But then, as quickly as it appeared, the mask went back up. "She was a threat. She knew too much. If she talked, everything I've built would have come crashing down." Claire's breath caught. "Built? Is that all this was to you? A game? A story you could control?" Her voice cracked. "You made me believe in something that wasn't real." I loved you, Ethan. I thought you were different." His eyes flickered with something, guilt, maybe, or was it regret? It was hard to tell, but it quickly disappeared, replaced by something harder, colder. "You don't know anything," he spat. "You think I wanted this life? You think I chose it? It wasn't about love, Claire. It was about survival. Everything I've done, I did for us. For you. I kept you safe." "Safe," Claire echoed, the bitterness rising in her throat. "You've kept me locked in a prison of lies, and now look at you. Look at what you've become." The officers were getting closer now, but Ethan hadn't noticed them yet. His attention was entirely on Claire, his face twisting in frustration. "You never understood," he murmured, taking a step toward her. "You never saw the bigger picture." "Ethan, it's over," Claire said, her voice shaking but steady. "You can't outrun the truth. You can't outrun what you've done." For a moment, silence hung in the air. Ethan's eyes locked on hers, and in that instant, Claire saw something that made her stomach turn. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't remorseful. He was only sorry that it had come to this. Sorry that his empire was crumbling. Without warning, Ethan turned and bolted for the back of the warehouse, his footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. Claire's heart pounded as she instinctively ran after him, her legs fueled by adrenaline and fear. She could hear the officers shouting behind her, but she didn't slow down. She couldn't. Not now. She turned a corner, and there he was. Ethan was standing at the edge of a large, open room, his back to her. The dim light from a broken window illuminated his silhouette. He didn't look back as she approached, but his voice was low, almost sad. "I never wanted this, Claire. I never wanted to hurt you." "You did," she whispered, taking one step closer. "You did hurt me, and now you'll have to face the consequences." Ethan turned, the coldness in his eyes sharpening into something more dangerous. "You think you've won. You think the police can stop me. They'll never get me. I'm too far gone." Before Claire could respond, a flash of movement, quick, like a shadow, rushed toward her. In that instant, everything seemed to slow down. Her heart stopped as she saw the glint of a knife in his hand. But before he could reach her, the officers burst in, guns drawn, and Ethan froze. The detective called for him to drop the weapon, his voice firm. Ethan stood there for a long moment, his face twisted with frustration and defiance. But then, slowly, he dropped the knife, letting it clatter to the floor. The silence that followed felt like a death sentence. Ethan was done. His empire had crumbled. The woman he had tried to control was standing over him, watching him fall. As the officers moved in to take him away, Claire stood still, her breath coming in ragged bursts. She hadn't won. Not yet. But the truth had finally been exposed, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a flicker of hope. Ethan was going to prison, and she was going to be free.